These are all Piers Morgan, but are they all the same beliefs? For almost 4 decades, Piers Morgan has lived a notable life in the public eye. We've watched him edit newspapers, campaign against the Iraq War, argue forcefully for gun control, befriend Donald Trump, then criticize Donald Trump. He voted Remain, then argued that the result of the Brexit referendum should be implemented. During COVID, Piers Morgan fiercely attacked the British government's handling of the pandemic. He is one of Britain's most prominent critics of what he calls woke culture. He left Good Morning Britain after a dispute over his comments about Meghan Markle, a departure he subsequently framed around freedom of speech. And what the war in Gaza allowed us to witness is how the severity of his criticism of the Israeli government changed publicly over time. If we put all of those positions alongside each other, one conclusion is tempting. Piers Morgan contradicts himself. But before reaching that conclusion, let's consider another possibility. What questions are we using to come to our determination? Is the question, what does Piers Morgan do when he talks? Or, why is his story hard to believe? Or even, is Piers Morgan consistent? But could we be focusing on the wrong questions? We should never lose sight of the idea that human beings don't only disagree because they possess different information, we also have different beliefs, fears, assumptions, values, and ways of interpreting reality, and Piers Morgan is no different. Each time he appears on our screens, we may be chomping at the bit to examine whether Piers Morgan is contradicting himself, or whether he's right or wrong. But why not look at something much more informative? How does a person like Piers Morgan become convinced of what they believe? And when that belief changes, what actually changed? Piers Morgan's journalism career began in local newspapers before he moved to The Sun, where he became closely associated with its celebrity coverage and the Bizarre column. In January 1994, Rupert Murdoch appointed 28-year-old Piers Morgan acting director of the News of the World. What a position that was! It made him the youngest editor of a British national newspaper for more than half a century. At this point, trying to define some fully formed political philosophy may tell us more about our desire for labels rather than about Piers Morgan himself. So instead, let's look at the behaviour. Piers Morgan was at this time a young journalist, focused on succeeding within 4 intensely competitive environments: the exclusive environment, the circulation battle environment, the celebrity access environment, and the attention environment. Now notice what just happened. We didn't allow observation alone to apprise us of Piers Morgan. We introduced interpretations. If we were merely observing, our focus would be his career, his actions, and his choices. Once we introduce ambitious, arrogant, driven into the picture, we now attach meanings to what we observe. And although there may be nothing wrong with doing that, we need to get better at deliberately separating the two. Observation comes first. Interpretation is what we subsequently make of it. And this is not only subjective, it too can be scrutinized. Take an interview where someone interrupts repeatedly. One viewer sees confidence, another sees arrogance, another sees someone refusing to be intimidated. Same behavior, different interpretation. So before we go any further, which Piers Morgan are you already constructing? During Piers Morgan's News of the World editorship, the Press Complaints Commission complaint concerning Victoria, Countess Spencer, was upheld. The coverage involved photographs and medical information while she was receiving treatment at a health clinic. The Commission concluded that there was no public interest justification for the story or pictures, and that the discussion of her health intruded into her privacy. The publisher accepted the adjudication and publicly criticised his editor, Piers Morgan. We can condemn that decision, defend it, or place it somewhere between the two. But first, notice the competing values: the public's right to know and the individual's right to privacy. Both can sound completely reasonable in isolation. The difficulty begins when they collide. That's where beliefs become interesting, because disagreement isn't always "I value freedom and you don't." Sometimes both people value freedom. They simply disagree about whose freedom matters most in the situation. Perspective influences what becomes visible. It's not reality itself, and as many of us now know, that distinction would follow Morgan throughout his career. Privacy versus disclosure, freedom versus responsibility, the right to speak versus the consequences of speaking. Piers Morgan was now editor of the Daily Mirror, a role he had held since 1995, and during the build-up to the Iraq War, the paper adopted an aggressively anti-war position. Morgan publicly defended that campaign, saying he made no apology for it. Even after the invasion, he maintained that the newspaper's original position had been justified. Now imagine two intelligent people watching the same events in 2003, both informed, both sincere, both convinced that human lives are at stake. One sees intervention against a dangerous regime. The other sees an unnecessary and disastrous war. How can they look at the same reality and see something so different? Could it be because intelligence processes information but doesn't choose every assumption with which we begin? It doesn't automatically determine who we trust, which risks frighten us, or which moral failure seems most dangerous. It's almost like two people standing at different windows looking at the same landscape. The landscape may be the same, but the viewpoint isn't. And here's where Piers Morgan becomes useful to us. Not because we can inspect what happened privately inside his head, we can't, but because so much of his public thinking has been recorded. We can watch beliefs meet events again and again. In May 2004, the Mirror published photographs presented as showing British soldiers abusing an Iraqi prisoner. The photographs were subsequently established to have been staged. The Mirror apologized unreservedly and announced that Piers Morgan would leave as editor. Contemporary reporting said Piers Morgan had been asked to issue a public apology, and it was understood that he had refused. The particular evidence may have collapsed, but Morgan's underlying opposition to the Iraq War didn't. And that's an important distinction, because discovering that one claim is wrong doesn't automatically tell us that the entire belief surrounding it is wrong. Sometimes one brick comes out and the building remains standing. Think about one of your strongest beliefs. If a piece of supporting evidence turned out to be false, what would you do? Abandon the entire belief? Modify it? Find another argument? Question the source? There isn't automatically a dishonest answer to any of these questions, but there's a revealing question all of us need to consider. What evidence would actually be enough to change my mind? And have I ever genuinely decided that in advance? Piers Morgan's next transformation was professional rather than ideological. It was television. America's Got Talent, Britain's Got Talent, and in 2008 he won the first season of Donald Trump's Celebrity Apprentice, defeating country singer Trace Adkins in the final. Something important had happened. Morgan, who once produced controversial media, was increasingly becoming the product. His opinions, his arguments, his reactions, his personality. And when a public behavior becomes part of anyone's identity, belief acquires another layer. Our identity mustn't be treated as something frozen. It is the continually evolving story we tell ourselves about who we are. and it's influenced by experience, memory, behavior, belief, and reflection. So consider this. If people begin knowing you as the person who never backs down, what happens when you discover that you might be wrong? Can you back down? Again, this isn't a claim about Morgan's private motives. It's a question his public life allows us to ask about ourselves. Have you ever defended an opinion partly because changing it felt like admitting something, not simply about what you believe, but about who you are? In 2011, Piers Morgan took over Larry King's primetime CNN slot. Following mass shootings in the United States, gun control became one of the defining campaigns of his CNN years. He argued forcefully for tougher restrictions. The opposition became so intense that a White House petition calling for his deportation attracted more than 100,000 signatures. And when his CNN program ended in 2014, Morgan used part of his final broadcast to return once again to gun control and the NRA. This creates an interesting problem, not for Morgan, but for our labels. If somebody first discovered Piers Morgan years later through arguments about woke culture, they might confidently predict his position on guns, and they might be completely wrong. Human beings like categories because categories reduce complexity. Left, right, liberal, conservative, us, them. Frameworks are useful, but what we're asking you to do is to notice when the framework stops helping you understand reality and starts deciding what you're capable of seeing. If one opinion allows us to confidently predict 20 others, are we understanding the individual or merely recognizing the tribe we've assigned them to? Piers Morgan became a permanent presenter on Good Morning Britain in late 2015. Then came Brexit. Morgan voted Remain. But after Leave won, he became angry at what he regarded as the failure to honour the referendum result. In 2019, he put it plainly. He had voted Remain, would vote Remain again, but had backed Boris Johnson's Conservatives partly because he wanted the referendum result implemented. Years later, his judgment of Brexit itself became much harsher. In June 2026, Morgan described Brexit as a pretty well unmitigated disaster. A Remain voter, defender of implementing Leave, later a severe critic of Brexit. If we are trying to place Morgan on a conventional political map, this can look contradictory. But perhaps the problem isn't Piers Morgan. Perhaps the problem is the map. One of the strongest metaphors we promote here at the Identity Maze is comparing beliefs to tinted glasses. Initially, you notice the color of the lens, wear them long enough, and eventually you stop noticing the glasses totally. The filter hasn't disappeared, it's become normal, and over time, we may begin not simply to believe what we see, but to see what we already believe. Now here's the uncomfortable version of that idea. Your opponents have lenses, and so do you. Piers Morgan's relationship with Donald Trump makes the tribal map even less useful. They had known each other since Celebrity Apprentice, and Piers Morgan publicly described Trump as a friend. But he also said their politics were very different. He specifically cited disagreements over guns, climate change, and abortion, and he criticized aspects of Trump's travel ban. Piers Morgan also challenged Trump over his retweeting of material from the far-right group Britain's First. Then came COVID. Piers Morgan became one of the most aggressive broadcast critics of Boris Johnson's government's handling of the pandemic. Government ministers stopped appearing on Good Morning Britain for months. Downing Street's boycott was lifted after 201 days. Morgan also turned sharply against Trump over his behavior during the pandemic, and after the January 6 attack on the US Capitol, Piers described Trump as unfit for office. Now, look at the pattern without trying to resolve it. A critic of woke culture who defended strict COVID rules, Trump's friend, who attacked Trump, a Remain voter, who demanded implementation of Brexit. Perhaps those are contradictions. But is it possible that human beings simply contain several principles at once? Freedom, order, loyalty, safety, democracy, accountability, and the difficult moments arise when two values we genuinely hold point in opposite directions. Which one wins? That's no longer really a question just for Piers Morgan. It's a question for all of us. When two of your values collide, which one do you protect first? And do you know why? After Harry and Meghan's interview with Oprah Winfrey in March 2021, Piers Morgan said on Good Morning Britain that he did not believe Meghan's account. The following day, he clarified that while he continued to question the overall veracity of her interview, he regarded mental illness and suicide as extremely serious and said people experiencing them should receive help. During the same programme, colleague Alex Beresford challenged Morgan over his treatment of Meghan. Piers Morgan briefly walked off the set. Later that day, ITV announced that following discussions with the broadcaster, Piers Morgan had decided to leave Good Morning Britain. Morgan then explicitly framed the dispute around freedom of expression, saying that freedom of speech was a hill he was happy to die on. But there's another piece of the story that's important. Ofcom subsequently concluded that the programme had not breached the broadcasting code. Its decision was finely balanced. The regulator described Morgan's comments as potentially harmful and offensive, while stressing both freedom of expression and the significance of the strong challenges to him from other contributors on air. Now observe the pattern. 2004, controversy, refusal to retreat, departure. 2021, controversy, refusal to retreat, departure. That's observation. What it means is interpretation. Did what we observe mean conviction, stubbornness, integrity, ego, principle? The same pattern can support several stories. So here's the more revealing question. Which explanation did you choose first? In April 2022, News UK's Talk TV launched Piers Morgan Uncensored. The company's own description presented the programme as a forum for lively debate that would celebrate free speech and people's right to share their views. The first major interview was Donald Trump. And yet, Piers Morgan confronted his old friend over Trump's claims about the 2020 presidential election. Once again, we notice a tussle or struggle between what some view as neatly aligned categories. Friendship without complete political agreement. Access without automatic loyalty. There's something worth holding on to here. Understanding someone's framework doesn't require agreeing with it. And this is why we at the Identity Maze value dialogue as collaborative exploration rather than simply competitive argument. So consider this small test. When somebody you like says something you strongly disagree with, what happens first? Interest or defense? And when somebody you dislike says something you agree with, why can agreement suddenly feel uncomfortable? In December 2023, the High Court handed down judgment in a civil case brought by Prince Harry and other claimants against Mirror Group newspapers. Justice Fancourt found that unlawful information gathering had been widespread at the group's titles, and that phone hacking became widespread and habitual from 1998. The judge also found that Piers Morgan knew about phone hacking while he was editor of the Daily Mirror. However, Morgan was not called as a witness in the trial. He strongly rejected the finding, saying he had never hacked a phone, instructed anyone to hack one, or knowingly participated in unlawful activity. But those two statements need to remain separate. What the court found and what Piers Morgan denies. Neither requires us to pretend the other doesn't exist. And this creates another kind of mirror. Every one of us has earlier versions of ourselves that our present identity must somehow accommodate. Sometimes we defend them, sometimes we regret them, sometimes we reinterpret them, sometimes we barely recognize them. Identity isn't a gallery-mounted portrait, it's an evolving story. After the October 7th attacks and the beginning of the Gaza war, Piers Morgan became associated with highly confrontational interviews about the conflict. One particularly visible example came in November 2023, when he repeatedly asked Jeremy Corbyn whether Hamas was a terrorist organization. Corbyn initially refused to answer directly, though he subsequently described Hamas as a terrorist group in a written article. Around the same period, Morgan's interview with Egyptian comedian Bassem Youssef became an enormous online success, exceeding 20 million YouTube views within weeks, and becoming Morgan's most watched uncensored interview at the time. Then something changed in Morgan's own expressed position. By May 2025, his criticism of the Israeli government had become noticeably stronger. Speaking with Mediasan, Morgan said, "I have resisted going as far as you have done in your criticism of the Israeli government. I resist no more." Be careful about what you think that proves. It doesn't establish that Piers Morgan simply changed sides. That's interpretation. What we can observe is narrower. The severity of his public expressed criticism changed. Was there new evidence? Was it because of accumulated events? Was it due to conversations? A different assessment of proportionality, a shift in which moral consideration carried the greatest weight. We don't know, and saying we don't know is important. Intellectual humility isn't weakness or indecision. It's recognizing that our understanding remains incomplete and being willing to revise beliefs when evidence or understanding changes. Perhaps changing your mind isn't always evidence that your thinking failed. Sometimes it may be evidence that thinking continued. Then came another transformation. In January 2025, Morgan's production company, Wake Up Productions, acquired the Piers Morgan Uncensored business and rights to its YouTube channel from News UK. News UK retained a commercial interest, but Morgan's company took ownership of the brand. The Piers Morgan career had almost travelled in a circle. Young journalist inside somebody else's newspaper, editor, television personality, broadcaster, and finally, proprietor of the media brand carrying his own name. Perhaps that is the most appropriate final public face. But someone increasingly controlling the platform through which his own arguments are distributed. So what has Piers Morgan's public life so far actually shown us? Not that he moved neatly from left to right. He didn't. Not that every public position changed. They didn't. Across the record, some themes repeat themselves. Gun control, opposition to the Iraq War, a growing emphasis on freedom of expression, repeated criticism of political figures he believes should answer questions directly, opposition to what he describes as woke culture. Other positions changed, other judgments developed. Relationships moved between friendship and hostility. And some beliefs simply refuse to fit comfortably inside one political tribe. Perhaps the temptation now is to finish this by deciding what all of that tells us about Piers Morgan. That would miss the more interesting opportunity, because while you've been watching him, you've also been revealing something about yourself. When you saw the tabloid editor, what did you assume? When you heard he opposed the Iraq War, did anything change? When you discovered his campaign for gun control, did the picture move again? What happened when Donald Trump appeared? Brexit, COVID, Meghan Markle, Gaza. At which moment did you feel sympathy? At which moment irritation? And at which moment did you feel certain? We spend an enormous amount of time examining other people's beliefs, far less examining our own. Yet beliefs rarely exist alone. We at the Identity Maze describe a belief architecture as a fusion of assumptions, experiences, values, memories, emotions, and knowledge interacting to support a worldview. And perhaps the strongest parts of that architecture are not the opinions we shout about. Maybe they're the assumptions we've stopped noticing, the rooms we've lived inside for so long that we no longer see the walls. They can pose a danger. Eventually, we can mistake the room for the entire world. Has Piers Morgan changed his beliefs? Or just changed his enemies? This question assumes that we know more than any one of us can possibly know. So, let's try something closer to home. Think about one belief you hold strongly today. Not something trivial, something connected to who you believe you are. Politics, family, religion, science, success, relationships, morality, yourself. Now ask, where did it come from? What experiences helped to build it? Which information do you notice because of it? Which information might you overlook? What would count as genuine evidence against it? And if you change your mind tomorrow, would that prove today's version of you was foolish? Or might tomorrow's version simply see something that today's version cannot yet see? We are not asking you to doubt everything. And we are not asking you to replace one certainty with another. What we are proposing is something more difficult. A purposeful shift in your thinking. Can you place curiosity before certainty, understanding before judgment, reflection before reaction? Because maybe the strongest mind isn't the one that never changes. Perhaps it's the one capable of noticing the lens and curious enough occasionally to examine it. Welcome to the Identity Maze.